When it comes to van life horror stories, it doesn't get much worse than waking up to find a stranger in the van with you. It happened to us in the dead of night while traveling through Mexico. Palenque is the closest town to the famous Mayan ruins of the Palenque archaeological site and to the waterfalls of Misolha and Agua Azul. But beyond its proximity to some of Chiapas's stunning historical and natural attractions, the town itself doesn't have much to recommend it. A city yet to capitalize on the tourism market that flocks here to explore Chiapas, Palenque has a reputation as a dingy and somewhat dangerous town. In our limited experience, the reputation is unfortunately warranted. Arriving in the afternoon, we elected to explore the city on foot to discover the charm we were sure others must have missed. After a couple of laps of downtown, we had to concede there wasn't much here to attract tourists. We felt a bit uneasy about camping in the car right in the middle of town and decided to park nearby to the tourist district at the eastern end of the town center. After an expensive beer in a depressing tourist bar, we decided to turn in for the night, excited to leave for the Palenque ruins first thing in the morning. In a moment of madness, we decided to park and camp in an unlit section of a dark street, around the corner from the small tourist district. When looking for safe places to camp in cities, the general rule is the more lighting and visibility, the better. At the time, already feeling uneasy about the city, we thought if we were out of sight, we might be less likely to attract unwanted attention, a terrible decision in hindsight. Around midnight, as we were falling asleep to the sound of the rain outside, someone came past the car and tried to open the locked doors. I yelled loudly and jumped out of bed, pulling back the window covers but couldn't see anyone on the darkened street. That event should have set off alarm bells and provided the motivation for us to seek out a safer place to camp for the night. But, tired and sleepy, we reasoned that it was just an opportunistic local who had tried and failed to make an easy score. They would have no doubt heard my yells, realized someone was in the car, and wouldn't return. With that, we fell into an uneasy sleep. In the pitch black, I awoke to a sound I had never heard before and hoped to never hear again. Kelly's piercing, blood-curdling scream seemed to go on and on. "What's happening?" I mumbled foggily. "There's someone—" "In the car!" Kelly cried, shaking me violently. "There's what?" I murmured, rubbing my eyes. "And now he's getting away!" Kelly shrieked. Drowsy and struggling to find my bearings in the pitch black, I swung myself out of bed, fumbled for the door handle, wrenched open the door, and jumped out of the car. By the time I found myself on the dark, wet street, there was no one to be seen. I clambered back into the car. "What just happened?" I asked, now fully alert. "I woke up thinking you were rustling about and asked what you were doing." Kelly recounted. "But then I realized that you were fast asleep, and the rustling was coming from the front seat. I looked up and I could just see the beady eyes of a man looking back at me. He must have only just realized we were in the car at that moment too, because he paused for a minute. That's when I started screaming and he took off." "Poor Kelly," I whispered to myself, stroking her fevered forehead. "She's had a terrible dream." "No, I haven't, you fucking idiot. Check the front." Sure enough, the lock barrel on our passenger door had been removed and a handful of items the thief had managed to grab in his panic missing. Thankfully, he had only grabbed an old raincoat and a camera lens. We were able to replace the lock barrel some days later in Merida. It would be a bit longer before we slept through the night.
Our car was stranded near Machu Picchu as protests and road blockades preventing access to the district of Santa Teresa ran into the second week. After 12 days in Cusco, we were ready to get moving again and were growing more and more impatient. Finally, we received the news we'd been waiting for. It was time to make the trip back to Santa Teresa to rescue our car and head for Lima and the coast. With a long journey ahead, we rose early, bags already packed, and took a cab across town to Kel Inca, where the Colectivos, Minivans or cars offering share rides bound for Santa Maria were waiting. After some negotiations in broken Spanish, we found a car that would take us to Santa Maria for 40 sols. After a long wait for a couple more passengers to fill up the sedan, we were off. We sped along at breakneck speed, winding up into the mountains along narrow roads, equal parts nauseous and terrified. After a 4-hour journey, we piled out of the car, relieved to have made it one piece. The price of the ride had doubled since we got in, and an angry spat between us and our driver broke out in halted Spanglish. The driver foolishly elected to negotiate the sudden price hike with Kelly, perhaps supposing she may have been the easier prey. I was happy to let him make this mistake. After 10 minutes, the driver began to sense the futility of his argument and threw up his hands, storming back to his car. Finding another colectivo, we continued on. We were taken along the narrow dirt road that snakes around a sheer canyon towards Santa Teresa. An hour or so later, after transferring into a third car in Santa Teresa, we finally arrived at the Hydroelectrica and walked across the bridge to the car park where I had left our van Pablo. We were excited to be reunited with our little van after so long. The owner of the car park greeted us wearily. He waved us over, looking concerned. He pointed out our front and rear right side tires, which were completely flat, both of them. This was as perplexing as it was frustrating. Our initial thought was that maybe the owner had punctured the tires and was going to try to extort us somehow as he ran off to get us a bicycle pump. We worked to put the spare tire on and pump up the back tire up in hopes we could make it the 30 minutes back to Santa Teresa before it deflated again. With the car park owner being so helpful, we began to doubt that it was he who orchestrated the damage. Suddenly it dawned on me what had happened. 11 days ago, when I had initially tried to drive the car out of Santa Maria, I had encountered a crowd of angry protesters, jeering, yelling, banging on the car, and making it clear that I was not going anywhere. It must have been this encounter that one of them had managed to put a number of tiny punctures in each tire, and the tires had deflated over the course of the last 2 weeks. Eventually, we had the car in a semi-drivable state and set off on the return leg to Santa Teresa. We rolled into the little town with our back wheel looking very sad. We tracked down the local mechanic, who after a brief inspection said he could fix the 5 puncture marks he found. I was certain I'd seen at least 3 marks on each tire and had him test again, but he was adamant he could only find 2 on the front and 3 on the back. We agreed to pay him 30 sols, or about $10 US. 40 minutes later, with the tires seemingly good to go, we jumped back in, laughing that finally this difficult day was all but done. We started off again, once more braving the sketchy cliffside roads between Santa Teresa and Santa Maria. About 5 minutes out from Santa Maria, Kelly leaned her head out of the window to check the weird sound our front wheels were making. Sure enough, the front tire had deflated again. Nothing to do but laugh and get on with it at this point. We jumped out and put the spare back on. It was now after 5 and the sun was setting on what had been a very long day, but we wanted to put some kilometers between us and Santa Maria, which had turned out to be a bit of a curse for us so far. Just up the road, we passed through the town of Quillabamba and tried again to have our front tire fixed. A busy garage surrounded by vans and tuk-tuks with 5 or so staff scurrying around doing nothing but prying off tires and rolling them to and from the shop seemed like a safe bet. 30 minutes and 16 sols later, we were assured that the last 4 punctures in the front tire had been found and repaired, and we set off again. We were heading for the coast of Peru, keen to get down out of the high altitude for a while. We had 2 options: to head back to Cusco and drive from there through to Lima, or cut directly through the jungle along Route 28B. A quick check of Google Maps indicated that we would shave 3 or 4 hours off the 19-hour trip if we headed straight through the interior, without circling back through the Urubamba Valley to reach Cusco first. What Google failed to mention was the condition of the road. That evening, we drove for another few hours along a road that steadily declined in quality and in width until we were shaking along a very dilapidated 1-lane road, albeit still on asphalt. Tuk-tuks and trucks whipped by us in both directions as I continued trundling along at 20 kilometers an hour, squinting into the pitch black. Eventually, we found somewhere to pull off, just off the shoulder of the road, and camped for the evening. After a quick dinner of grilled cheese, we crawled into the back of the van and passed out. The following day, we were woken by the sound of motorbikes and trucks hurtling past our makeshift campsite. After a bowl of cereal, we began again, and the reality of the journey we had embarked on set in. We were to wind through mountains and valleys, jungles and scrub, waterfalls and cliffs. At times the asphalt would end abruptly, leaving poor Pablo van go to bump along at 20 or 30 kilometers an hour, violently shaking our poor little van and everything inside. The scenery was stunning, but the distance and the speed at which we could travel were daunting. We plunged on through the jungle-clad mountains and eventually climbed out of it onto an unnamed peak high in the clouds, before finally descending into another valley to reach Kimbiri, a remote mountain town. Kimbiri was larger than most of the little villages we had seen in the previous 2 days. Kelly reassured me that Kimbiri was a large enough town that it all but guaranteed a return to sealed roads for the remainder of the journey. The town was a mud pit, rain-heavy traffic, and roadworks, by the looks of it working on a dual-carriage highway that would have been super handy had it been completed, had turned the remaining accessible roads into soup. We picked our way carefully through the town and made it out to the other side. On the other side of the town, a steep ascent to exit the valley was waiting. Unfortunately, Kelly's optimism was unfounded, and rather than the promised asphalt, we were treated to more thick mud and a widened road to slip about on. Cars and semi-trailers fanned out across the road, wheels spinning in the mud, sliding slowly toward the top of the mountain. Like some sort of high-stakes bumper cars turning, was near impossible as the van slid this way and that, and we tried to avoid the cars sliding down in the opposite direction, as well as the lunatics that had decided this was the best time to overtake. After a tense half hour, we hit gravel again and were able to accelerate back up to 30 kilometers an hour. Just up. The way we hit bitumen roads again and let out a whoop, we stopped around dusk, pulling off the road where we could. We quickly scrambled some eggs for dinner and crawled into bed to escape the bugs. It had been another trying day, but we were cautiously confident that things could only improve from here as we began our descent down the Andes toward the sea the following day. The next day, thankfully, we caught a break as we enjoyed some of Peru's finest asphalt snaking down the Andes. Glorious views of snow-capped peaks and mountain villages greeted us around every bend, and we were elated to be able to start closing some of the distance between us and Lima. Finally, around lunchtime, we reached the end of the infamous 28B in the town of Ayacucho. We stopped at a street-side stall for roast pork sandwiches and grabbed some supplies before setting off into the table ends. Again, the view as we descended from almost 5,000 meters was nothing short of spectacular, and we happily snapped photos and recounted our own van life horror stories from the previous 3 days to one another. That night, we stopped at the Runiac ruins in Hutoro, where we found an incredible campsite above the ruins, completely devoid of anyone besides a couple of local stray dogs. As the sun set into the valley in front of us, we basked in the glow of our adventure and looked forward to the dream of reaching the Peruvian coast the following day.